This is a webcast recording from Modern European History, SI5, Lasting Impact of 9/11. I suspect there's quite a few impacts that 9/11 terrorist attacks have had on the United States and the world. We're going to take a look at 6 of them. The first being the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act is legislation passed by Congress in 2001 following the 9/11 terrorist attacks that increases the power of the federal government and law enforcement agencies to be able to monitor and investigate persons or groups who may have hostile intent on the United States and its citizens. It also increased the ability of the government to keep people out or to detain and deport any individual that was in the United States legally with a visa but might be hostile towards the United States and its people. And interestingly enough, the Patriot Act also included domestic terrorism, meaning that these powers of the federal government and law enforcement agencies could be directed towards American citizens who were deemed as a threat to the United States government and its citizens. The government website that I'm clicking on here just shows you a definition of the Patriot Act and kind of just gives you some descriptions of it and its intent, which I'm not really expecting that you're reading this, but I did want to show you the banner, the Patriot Act, Preserving Life and Liberty. An interesting tension that you always have is the tension between security and liberty. You cannot have both simultaneously at 100%. One will be emphasized more than the other. And certainly after 9/11, there's a greater emphasis and there's a collective approval of increasing our security from threats so that something like 9/11 couldn't happen in the future. And so as a consequence, the Patriot Act was passed. But over time, it's been over a decade now since 9/11. There's opposition to the Patriot Act. There's certainly concerns that an increased power of the federal government to be able to monitor and investigate, collect information on individuals or groups may be a threat to civil liberties that are protected and guaranteed in the Constitution. An interesting story in all of this is the Boston Marathon bombing and the manhunt for the 2 brothers who were responsible. You can see in this collage Boston police going through the streets and you have into the homes manhunt. Now as we watch the story unfold in the news, no one was outrightly concerned or even in opposition to the use of this type of force conducting this manhunt. But those people who are concerned with the Patriot Act and the tension with civil liberties did point out on how quickly a police state could be put into play. The whole city of Boston was shut down, and how potentially constitutional liberties like the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unlawful searches and seizures, could limit civil liberties and maybe even be as a consequence of unintended consequences. Interesting issues and tensions for us to be aware of and to be examining, thinking about, and discussing. After 9/11, you had a new element to the executive branch of the federal government with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Clearly, as you can see there with letter A of its mission, it is to defend the United States from terrorist acts. One of the things that it did was it instituted a multicolored color system to be able to communicate and inform the American public about what type of risk we were facing depending upon the information that we were gaining about potential terrorist threats. And of course, when this was published, it was mocked quite often. You see this guy explaining the multicolored system. It was almost kind of like, kind of archaic system. Like we're going back to the 1950s and we're duck and covering in a nuclear age attack. I mean, really, is this going to protect us and prevent terrorist acts? So, there were some elements to all this that people kind of scratched their heads about. One other element that you see within the Department of Homeland Security, which has had a tremendous impact on Americans, is the TSA, or the Transportation Security Administration. So anytime you've traveled on an airline and you've been having to go through security lines and maybe have your baggage checked or go through x-ray machines, this is all a consequence of the 9/11, I should say post 9/11 world, where security is at a higher level than it was any time before 9/11. Military service. We've had over 5,000 Americans killed in the two simultaneous wars, in this war on terror. Of course, a whole lot more wounded, quite a few dealing with significant post-traumatic stress disorder disabilities. One of the factors of all this is how exhausted our military is right now of having to fight two wars simultaneously, without a draft, without forcing people into military service. People have volunteered to do so and have had to fight and called to fight multiple tours, which leaves people, physically, emotionally, psychologically exhausted. And so quite a lot of ongoing effects of that. We have a strong dependence upon defense contractors, which I think is quite an interesting issue. If you look at the link is a speech that President Eisenhower made as he was leaving office in 1961, in which he warns of the growing influence of what he called the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is the defense industry, and as you can see in this graphic, in the war on terror years, the defense industry has made a lot of money on producing weapons and military armaments for the United States government to conduct the war on terror. So, this raises some interesting issues, particularly the profitability of war, that probably need to be thought through and examined, and certainly, in relationship to the warning that Eisenhower made in his farewell address, which you can listen to on this YouTube link. Also, one other matter that I think is interesting to consider is the use of unmanned drone strikes to be able to target Al-Qaeda, Taliban, insurgency opposition. And these strikes are largely conducted through CIA operations, which doesn't have the same amount of oversight as normal military operations. Oftentimes, CIA, because of security issues, can operate in what they call dark, which means they don't really have to be forthright with what they're doing, which makes sometimes these drone strikes, come into question of whether or not they're hitting reasonable targets, and whether they're, the authority of these drone strikes is justifiable. So a lot of military service issues, impacts that the war on terror has forced the United States to face. Immigration, a lot of people being kept out of the country because of increased immigration restrictions, and then interesting deportation numbers have increased dramatically, particularly under the President Obama administration. Economic impacts, pretty staggering. The war on terror has cost $1.4 trillion, and it's increasing. Take a look at this graphic here. This graphic shows you the cost of the war on terror, both wars, the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and then the collective total. Staggering amounts of money for these military operations. One of the reasons why the number is going to continue to grow, even when we're done with the military operations is that there will be a tremendous amount of costs for health benefits towards soldiers that will be needing disability payouts due to their war traumas. The other effect that we look at is how much did the war on terror costs affect the Great Recession that the United States has experienced, and is just now showing signs of coming out of. Um, of course, the Great Recession was caused by economic and business factors, but the war on terror cost had and certainly had some impact as we're increasing our defense spending to pay for the war. We're depending on foreign nations also, particularly China, to help offset our debt. Our debt right now sits at $16 trillion. That's insane, which doesn't give us a lot of flexibility and stability for our federal budget and the health of our American economy. So certainly the war on terror did destabilize our economy. If you look at this, this is another kind of staggering animated graphic which just shows you I mean, take some time to look at that. Here's our national debt right here, debt per person, right? Federal budget deficit, how much spending we're conducting. There's just so much stuff there to look at, but it's not a good picture. Um, the United States economy certainly is burdened by the level of indebtedness that our federal government is in at the moment. So a lot of impacts there that 9/11 and then the following war on terror have had on the United States.